Fox Hollow is the sort of place you could actually never leave.
It was isolating. Andrew was able to put pressure on people and control and manage things in ways that he hadn't before.
We were living in that context where everything mattered. Everything was so intense. As painful as it was also thrilling. You felt like you had to come through. Every moment, from the moment you woke up till you went to bed, and then sometimes even what you were doing while you were asleep mattered. So we lived in this high-stakes atmosphere that was thrilling. I was in my 20s during all this. It was just awesome. There was parts of it that were just awesome, and it was real. And at least we all believed it. The difference between a public retreat and then what happened when it was just Andrew and the students on a retreat was profound.
In his eyes, whatever he said was true. He had an opinion that was correct.
Right, he's going to kick me out. It creates a sense of panic, of fear, of I have something important to lose. You've had to fight harder. You've had to show deeper commitment than you did last time you came back. Respond more. Maybe that means more money.
You think a lousy 10 grand is gonna buy me off?
Andrew and everybody had created basically a pressure cooker for spiritual evolutions.
I was going to need to do something outrageous that was going to get them to sit up and listen.
So there's a list of accusations against Andrew. I think it's called the A list of abuses.
Andrew was going to take you up on this finger amputation.
In the lake, the person I was with appeared to be unconscious.
She was afraid for her life, but she believed that if she died, that could only be just because of her betrayal of Andrew.
I somehow thought I could get away with this kind of behavior. There was kind of a wildness and a radical fire in me that I didn't care.
He totally does revel in this sense of public humiliation.
A lot of what Andrew did was insane, utterly insane.
I wanted us to have an ashram because I wanted a place that people could come to spend time with me, a place where we could all do spiritual practice together in earnest, where we could have our own environment that was free from the distractions of the world. And it was a place where the teachings that we were putting so much effort into living could really be the shared intersubjective cultural context that was being lived in that environment.
The Fox Hollow property that was on the market was located in 1996. Fox Hollow was originally a Vanderbilt estate, and 36 apartments in 3 buildings and several other single-family houses. It was 200 acres, enormous manor house.
Fox Hollow was owned by the Westinghouses in rural Massachusetts, out in the hills in the Berkshire Mountains, up on the top of one of these little mini peaks. Beautiful setting and this glorious old estate.
Bill and Jane picked me up and at the train station, and I got out of the train station, and this black Volvo, which the community had bought for me as a gift, was there with a huge ribbon on it. And so we drove in the black Volvo up to Fox Hollow, and it was so beautiful. It was so much love. Everybody was so happy. The intensity of the emotion that was being shared then was quite magical. I mean, everybody was just excited and full of anticipation that, you know, we had our own home, and this is the place where we could live the teachings 24 hours a day. We could create our own world.
We purchased with a major donation from one student who donated over $2 million to purchase this property for $2.8 million.
Jane desperately did not want her family to know that she was involved with Andrew.
She said she hadn't received the funds yet, so she wouldn't be able to do it for a certain period of time.
She agonized over it. That balance between family and Andrew was excruciating.
So instead of me doing the intelligent thing and just letting it be, we wanted it so badly that we said, well, do you think you could get it sooner?
I was very, it's totally understandable, Jane. I was like trying to give her all the space in the world. However, that was not seen well. because I got really seriously yelled at. Don't you want Andrew to have Fox Hollow? I was being too soft on her. They wanted, right there.
The mistake I made was putting the pressure on it. I put pressure on it if we should give it sooner because I wanted to get the property so much. She said to me, look, the only thing I care about is I don't want my family to know, I don't want my sister to know, something like that. I think I encouraged Mimi to calm Jane's concerns.
It was really awful. And then she finally figured out a way to do it. Jane only pushed one condition on the donation, and that it should be anonymous. Andrew broke that confidence.
Because later on she tried to sue me. She tried to sue us. She totally flipped the story around, and she turned in, she felt she'd been totally manipulated, and suddenly I was seen as a crazy mad cult leader. I'm sure, to be transparent with you, that I wanted the property to happen so much that I overrode the signals that were coming my way to just let it be. In the context of look, it was all f***ed up. I shouldn't have done it.
Andrew never really had to worry about money. He was able to spiritually seek, and then he was surrounded by students, and we basically paid his way. We supported him, because he was the teacher. He never had to worry about it. He lectured us that life wasn't going to be as easy monetarily on the East Coast. We had many, Europeans, people who it was difficult to work in America. People did what they could. But, Andrew was warning us that sort of work wouldn't be available where we were going, and we had to get our financial stuff together.
Andrew instituted an idea that people who had been his students couldn't come to Fox Hollow until they'd made a donation. And the amount of the donation required was based on how long they'd been a student. So it was $1,000 for every year that somebody had been a student.
This is like 1997, so if you'd been in the community since 1990, you were supposed to come up with $7,000, which was an enormous amount of money for most of these people. It was said, if you didn't come up with that money, you would never set foot on Fox Hollow.
Where I know that my hit was 8,000, which I totally did not have, which meant more credit card debt. That's
how a lot of the money was raised for the quite extensive upgrading and remodeling that was done.
I do know that there's some people, to this day, I think are still, indebted because of that. People were, financially strapped because they were following him. They were supporting his dream. They were doing everything for him. And their credit cards were run up, and he had not the slightest bit of gratitude.
Financially, I didn't give anything. The thought wouldn't have even occurred to me. Everybody was more than happy to do anything and everything they could to make it possible for me to give the gifts that I was giving.
Enlighten Next was trying to create some sort of ripple in consciousness that could really elevate everybody. Maybe people wouldn't even know what hit them. And in our world, it looked like producing a magazine to try to spread the teachings and to really elevate consciousness. It was a weird sense of righteousness, and of rightness about the thing we were doing. We were the pinnacle. We were doing the most important thing on the planet. We would do our day job, and then we would volunteer in our evenings and weekends and work for the bigger project. Working on the magazine, working on the grounds to keep the property up, etc.
But during those successful years, Enlighten Next had a cash flow of about $3 million a year. And some things were very expensive, like the magazine was very expensive. It takes a tremendous amount of money, actually. Putting on a retreat in India and things that were overseas, they were quite costly. And then there was a staff. There were a lot of people who received a salary, 10 or 20 people full-time. And then everybody else worked as a volunteer. 60 or 80 people lived there. Another maybe 50 lived in surrounding communities and in Boston and New York. When there were events there would be over 100 people there.
There's websites, there's marketing, there's outreach, there's sales, there's graphic design, and there's, of course, keeping our lives together, cooking, maintaining the grounds, maintenance. There's lots of different jobs and lots of different projects which are all part of this expanding sense of mission.
After a while at Fox Hollow, I started looking around, and I realized that everybody thought that they'd arrived. I saw a lot of self-satisfaction. It seemed to me that most people were convinced that they were living with the greatest teacher in the world in this beautiful place, which automatically would have to mean that they were amongst the luckiest and the coolest and the most evolved people on the planet. That was when I started insisting that the teachings be lived with a much deeper level of urgency and commitment and responsibility. Because the thing is, but I didn't want followers, I wanted partners. I wanted people who wanted to do this with me as much as I wanted to do it with them. Follower is someone who passively adores you. So many gurus have those kind of students, and I didn't want to have anything to do with those kind of relationships. I actually couldn't stand it.
There's a list of accusations against Andrew. I think it's called the A-list of abuses.
I think that A-list of individual, particularly gross and concrete abuses is a really important piece of history.
There are people who had been loyal to him from absolutely day one, given everything, including their wallets. Like one fellow was trying to do a writing project and just couldn't get it on paper, something that really worked. And he, in his distress, said to Andrew, "If I can't write something that's good enough for you, I will cut off my finger." He couldn't write this piece that he was asked to write. Andrew had a doctor in the community go to him and say, "Andrew's going to take you up on this finger amputation." And she laid out all the scalpel and all the tools and put your hand here on the table. Everything up to actually using the knife.
It was never going to happen. There was never a chance anything like that was ever going to happen. I mean, I was wrong. I was completely wrong in that instance because as a result of it, that individual lost his own confidence, lost his spiritual self-confidence. So if that was the result of me pushing him in that way, then I was wrong. My judgment was wrong. I know he ended up suffering a lot as a result of losing confidence in himself, and that was really the result of that particular exercise. So I failed. I did damage to a person that didn't deserve it. And this shows you how crazy I'd become. I mean, when I think about this particular incident is something I've thought about a lot as a way to kind of wake me up to places when I'd really gone a little crazy and crossed the line. In some context, it makes sense, but outside of that context, just on a human level, it's insane. It was really insane, and I lost a very beautiful person. I mean, I loved him very much, and so thinking a lot about what happened there, I see places where I really had gone mad.
There's a meeting in the sauna in the basement at Fox Hollow. It's one of the punishment areas.
Andrew started putting up cartoons of us, which mostly involved our betrayal of him. He would take letters that were bad and he'd put them up and he'd splash red paint, which was supposed to be the guru's blood, over them.
I had videos going down there. One was the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator. We had it playing 24 hours. It was down there and all the walls were covered with these letters expressing this insane defiance and being aware of it. We called it the Holocaust Museum. They even would make these huge photos of my eyes, put them up on the ceiling. And then each day people would go down to see what was the latest addition to this Holocaust Hell Museum.
There's been some kind of crisis where one of the women has made a mistake. And then somebody suggests that we do an hour of prostrations in the lake, which is on the property at Fox Hollow. And the prostrations, that involves immersing yourself in waist-deep water and then raising one's arms up into the air and then plunging beneath the surface of the water whilst chanting, "Face everything and avoid nothing." This suggestion was made to Andrew as a way of making amends or appeasing him, so we get a message back that the offer has been accepted. The trouble with this plan was that it was, I think, the end of October. There are about 25 women, and there's somebody on the bank who is there to monitor it with an alarm clock and ready to help people out if they should need it. Some people got all the way through the hour, and about a third maybe didn't. And some people had to be carried back to the house. I didn't manage it, so I came out And after warming up in the bath, we all collected in a room. Then there was a sort of interrogation between ourselves about which people had succeeded and which people hadn't. The ones who hadn't succeeded, there was a second scheduling of immersions in the lake. Well, I think it might have been November by this time. And we didn't have anybody to monitor the situation at all. I remember that quite early on in the lake, shaking with such intensity that, I mean, it was completely uncontrollable, but also it was like Jaws. The teeth were rattling so hard that you felt like your teeth were going to break. The shaking eventually stopped and you would become calm. The desire to get out disappeared altogether. I have no idea how we got back to the houses afterwards. There's actually a complete blank from getting from the lake back to the house. I was extremely worried because we were all sitting in baths and the person I was with appeared to be unconscious. And I asked for a doctor and the doctor it wasn't an option. We were so numb that we couldn't feel anything until after being in the bath for quite a long time, the pain would start. Sensation would return, which was excruciating. The more I thought about it over the years, the more I began to see it as a really dangerous, irresponsible situation. At that time, I would have seen just as another example of pushing myself to the limits to find God, if you like.
They try to justify it now because some women came up with the idea, and I know how that works, because when you're all mixed in self-doubt, you're all crazy, and someone comes up with a crazy idea, no one has the idea to say that's a crazy idea and shoot it down. There was one woman, was just recently a formal student. I talked with her, I found out her account of all this, and she told me what it was like. Her skin turned blue, her jaw locked up. After a while, she couldn't move. All she could do was cling to the edge. She was just praying for someone to come and find her. What the worst thing she told me is, she told me at that time she was afraid for her life. But she also told me that she believed that if she died, that could only be just because of her betrayal of Andrew. That's what Andrew did to the woman. That's what he did with people.
It made me think about what I would have been prepared to do in other circumstances if Andrew had asked us to do something, or even if I had just thought, it'll please Andrew if I do this. What would I have been prepared to do, and what would I have been prepared to do to other people? How far would I have gone in abandoning my once conscience in order to please my authoritarian guru? And I don't know.
I mean, I can't tell you what it was like. It was like I was literally going crazy. I was literally doing battle with almost everybody that was here. Because they weren't meeting this call to come together beyond ego. This was a story of their own individual and collective defiance. But it felt like Nazi Germany. I'm not kidding. I actually understand what happened in Nazi Germany because there was a collective collusion in denial. And I said, you guys cannot go on like this. You're going to meet me or the whole thing's going to fall apart.
Following a retreat in France, Andrew and a group of us went to a villa for a work vacation. Andrew blurted out without any context something that I had shared with him years prior in confidence about something in my life. When he said it in front of the others, I was totally shocked. I didn't know what to say. And I got, very upset, and there was just kind of a growing chasm between Andrew and me that happened very fast. And Andrew told a woman to come and slap me in the face. Very vulnerable secrets about my life had been just blabbed out in front of others. That was very upsetting, and then I got slapped for being upset. I was told I couldn't come back to the US, and everything was turned upside down. I had a determination to somehow keep going in a very bad situation. I didn't leave then. I stuck around. I was still there for 2 more years. I think I felt that somehow through loyalty and hard work, I could come through anything in life. I've already been here 10 years. I can't just throw all this away now. I had received an $80,000 inheritance. I decided that maybe that's the thing that's going to turn this around. If I give enough, maybe I'll, confront my karma. I got a message, Andrew wanted me to send it in. So I sent in my $80,000 donation. Eventually I left. But then after a year, I wrote him a letter and confronted him on the $80,000 donation that I had made under duress. And I said that I demanded it back. And to my surprise, I got a phone call from him. And she said, what do you want to see? Do you want to see me on my knees in front of the whole world admitting that I'm wrong? And I said, Andrew, I just want my money back. I got a letter from his attorney that said, you can have your money back, but you have to sign an agreement, which I call a gag order, to not speak publicly about Andrew Cohen for 5 years. So during that time, I made a decision, I'm going to write a book about it. So if I'm gagged, I'll be the opposite of gagged at the end of 5 years. This was published shortly after the gag order ended.
If it would have been one book by one disgruntled person, it could maybe be understood to be that individual's projection. But I was so attached to seeing myself as being without flaw that I was able to keep myself protected, insulated and protected from having to come to terms with any of that or having to face it at all. When you're in a spiritual cult where the identity of the teacher is being protected, then people are not allowed to think freely anymore. There becomes a certain kind of thought or mind control context. And unfortunately, this happens in a lot of spiritual groups, and it happened, it happened in our group also. It's astounding.
I ended up in this position of spending a lot of time with Andrew. So I learned some things about him and about how to do things well with him. A lot of that was authentic. He really did genuinely have a spiritual power and transmission. He really had a lot of those things, but he also had tremendous self-doubt. He cared a ton about what people thought about him. He was always manicuring his reputation, super careful about everything, super paranoid, control freak, jealous of other spiritual teachers. When he's always thinking, how do I look? He was extremely self-image conscious, and I think that was just part of his personality. It got amped up by this whole guru role.
There was a need in me for other people to see me as being perfect. That was unwholesome and unhealthy, and that in some ways I was hiding in this role. I needed to protect the illusion that Andrew was perfect. I would almost never go out on my own, and I'd always want to be with people who I trusted. Anybody who didn't know me very well, if they were going to be in my company, they'd always be in part of this larger circle, which is always what happens around gurus. I fell into that hole, I fell into that trap. If I'd have to go into a situation with a lot of people and be on my own, to be without an attendant, I would feel incredibly insecure, which indicates that I was trying to project some kind of illusion.
Andrew came on our radar in the early 2000s as a spiritual teacher, author, and somebody that we wanted to work with to explore the question of enlightenment. His magazine, What is Enlightenment, was just newly published at the time, and we reached out to him to record an audio series on the topic, What is Enlightenment? We spent about 3 days in the Sounds True studio. What I noticed as the recording went on, he was making some distinctions between impersonal enlightenment and personal enlightenment, and to be honest, I just wasn't clear on what he was saying, so it was a little frustrating. But I also felt off. I felt like we're talking about a topic nothing short of the ultimate deliverance of the spiritual journey, and I'm not feeling peaceful, expanded, at home. I'm not. I feel just a little kind of twisted and confused. That's how I felt inside my body. So I also really trust that. I had some concerns. Interestingly, I got a phone call from a Sounds True author, and I told him that I was recording the series with Andrew Cohen and that I had some misgivings about it, wasn't going very well. And this author, who's someone I've worked with for a long time and I really respect, said to me, "I beg you not to publish that." And I was like, wow, that's strong language. I beg you not to publish that. And he said, yeah, I've worked with a lot of ex-Andrew Cohen students, and quite honestly, Tammy, it is a mess. It is an absolute mess. The trail that he is leaving behind him of pain and confusion. That was all I needed to hear, and I did cancel the project. In and of itself, this is not that astounding a story. However, a couple of weeks later, Andrew Cohen's team asked me if they could publish the recordings themselves. And they said, oh my God, Andrew has never been so clear. Fine, you can have the recordings and do with them what you want. A couple of days after, someone who works with me says, there's a flower delivery for you. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Not a flower delivery, but 3 flower trucks. You know, you're talking about like those lobby style, restaurant style arrangements. Come in, beautiful vases, and they're put in a circle all around the lobby. And I'm thinking to myself, who on God's green earth would send me this number of flower arrangements? The card says something to the effect of, the interview we did was so powerful. To me, it was like you were on the verge of becoming enlightened and going up in flames at any given moment. And I thought I was on the verge of becoming enlightened. I was, frustrated out of my wits' end, actually, if you want to know what was happening for me. Thank you, Andrew. I had some people who work with me bring it all to the children's hospital nearby, and I was like, just get all these flowers out of here. And quite honestly, I never understood the meaning of that. I thought, if you're using your students' good money to send somebody like me thousands of dollars worth of flowers, there's something very odd going on here, because I never even understood what the communication was supposed to be.
It was very funny, because at the time we always talked about, Andrew's incredibly inventive teaching techniques. His teaching techniques were extraordinarily simplistic. One teaching I remember was his, it doesn't matter what you think, it doesn't matter what you feel, all that matters, what you do. And I found that very, profoundly interesting. I only started to understand Andrew's teaching techniques when I stopped looking for any deep explanation and looked for the simplest explanation I could come up with, and then it was just right there.
So the egomaniac narcissists, they're always manipulating the world around them to prove the reality of this. You understand? So for example, someone who hates themselves, terrible, unpleasant person, they are gonna act in ways that repel you. They're gonna make sure that they really turn you off. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not an accident. They're gonna prove it's true. Well, it's true.
Everyone was living more or less under each other's nose, especially Andrew's, and so he was able to put pressure to bear on people in ways, and control and manage things in ways that he hadn't before.
Fox Hollow was such an intense atmosphere. I mean, it was so spiritually charged. Andrew and everybody had created basically a pressure cooker for spiritual evolution. So everything about the place was supposed to have you constantly evolving and developing. But you don't really know what that's like until you live there. Because when you live there, it's 24/7 and eyes are on all the time. It was like being in a spiritual tornado, because the pressure was so high. It was a rigorous schedule of getting up, starting meditation at 7 a.m. For 2 hours, doing prostrations before that, then having breakfast in silence for an hour, getting ready for the day, then working with everyone, and then having lunch with everyone, and then working the second half of the day. And then being on the magazine crew was a totally different thing. So we'd work all day, and then we would meet with Andrew in the evenings. Writing is always hard, and publishing of anything, and there's gonna be lots of editorial reviews, but imagine if you add then the whole spiritual component. So you're not just being judged on the quality of your writing, you're being judged on the quality of your perspective and what that says about you and your spiritual development. And your spiritual teacher, the one who's responsible for all of that, and the master of all that, is the one assessing both. And so I was just a blubbering idiot, in the beginning, but I just kept going for it. I kept going for it. You never had someone that you could be really transparent with. You could never just say, hey, here's really what I think. without having some fear of that being reported to someone and being taken out of context, and then you having repercussions for that. So we were all about the authentic self. That was the biggest expression of evolutionary enlightenment, was to be able to embody the authentic self. Ironically, very few of us had a lot of authenticity in our relationships, but it was a very lonely, lonely place. And it meant that you couldn't trust anyone. You couldn't trust anyone. You couldn't even trust your spouse, because nothing could be just held between people. There were no secrets. Everything was always reported on. Women reported to other women about what was happening in their marriage. Men reported to other men about what was happening in their marriage. Things were dictated by everyone else. There was no personal life. The personal is what we were trying to eliminate. We were all about the impersonal. We had this utopian vision of a society of independent individuals who didn't have to get into the personal with each other. And it backfired.
Many students who, I guess, attended online seminars and had good experiences, right? And they're never going to have that experience with Andrew because they'll never get that close to him. So
the difference between a public retreat and then what happened when it was just Andrew and the students on a retreat was profound. He went from sweet, enlightened, loving, amazing, compassionate, waking everyone up. Even if he was kind of hard and crass at sometimes, he was always waking up and supporting. And then behind the scenes, and he was impatient, hardcore, cussing, swearing, irreverent. F you, what the hell is happening here? What are you guys doing? Stop wasting my time. He became a completely different person. So I went from meeting him the first time in this public setting, being like, oh my God, amazing, to then going behind closed doors.
I am not a teacher. If I'm a teacher, you're a teacher. Okay? Then I'll accept being a teacher. But if you're not a teacher, I'm not a teacher. Okay, Joel?
Oh yeah.
The Dharma battles that happened at Fox Hollow were of a different order than a lot of people are familiar with, because I was very concerned with trying to actualize this potential that was emerging between us at higher and higher levels. I was taking an absolute position, and I wasn't going to move. I was going to need to do something outrageous that was going to get them to sit up and listen. This was the beginning of a series of crazy wisdom or outrageous challenges I was bringing to these most committed students who were living there with me, to go a lot deeper and to take much more responsibility for what we were trying to do together.
It all centered around this sense of fear, the sense of, I have something to lose, right? He's going to kick me out. I'm going to lose my peer group. And to be honest, after a few years of living inside this bubble, those are your friends, your family, this is your world. And somebody's threatening to basically take you out of your world. It's actually quite a powerful motivator. It doesn't mean you're more capable, but it creates a sense of panic, of fear, of, I have something important to lose. And this is by design, it's not accidental. A lot of the ways Andrew would create pressure was activating that fear, threatening to kick you off of the property, which was not an idle threat. We watched our friends stay in hotels for days or weeks at a time. Every cycle of contracting and being kicked out, or expanding and being invited back in, it kind of digs you in deeper. It's like a corkscrew in a sense. You fought your way back, which means as you get older in the teachings, you spent more time, that you've had to fight harder. You've had to show deeper commitment than you did last time you came back. Respond more. Maybe that means more money. You basically dig yourself in deeper. You find a deeper sense of commitment to the project that we're working with. So yeah, it starts to make less and less sense leaving. I see, in a sense, why Andrew constructed the context this way, because it puts a lot of pressure on the soul. And he used to say, that pressure creates diamonds. So this was not an accident, but this pressure and the desperation that comes of that pressure, best case scenario, produces a person that pops out of themselves into their next level potential. Andrew was doing a 4-day weekend, little mini retreat in London, and I was contracted and struggling. Nobody was getting through to me. I sat in a small room with 2 or 3 senior students, nailing me to the wall, telling me how horrible I was, which is, the long way to say what they were in their minds trying to do was help me. But that's what it actually looked like, was them sitting in a room yelling at me, humiliating me, making me feel like I was a total failure. And at the end of the weekend, there's 200 people on retreat with Andrew. In the last session, I was invited back into the main hall with everybody, and Andrew asks them to give me the mic. And Andrew is like basically humiliating me in front of the entire crowd. Like, here's a guy who looks nice, you wouldn't hurt a fly, would you? But when it comes to the spiritual life, you're like, you'll kill anybody who gets in your way. It was his way of making sure that you knew, you were getting squashed in front of as many people as he could do it in front of. I mean, at the time, it was just super painful for me, but in retrospect, I'm like, it's hard to really relate to his power trip. Maybe he totally does revel in this sense of public humiliation. I mean, there's so much power in it.
The position as personal assistant grew into the message giver. He would dictate the message to me. And then I had to read it back to him to make sure that it was all right or he wanted to change it. One of the more absolute flagrant lies was that Andrew doesn't solicit money from people. No, the donations are freely given, blah, 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 is what the answer was. Message that I gave. You think a lousy 10 grand is going to buy me off? You better start thinking of something else, or you're not going to set foot on the property again. That's the way he talked, and he meant it. This person had offered $10,000, and it wasn't enough.
When I would make a mess, he would be begging for a response. And what does that mean, a response? That means some sort of gesture to say, okay, I'm back on track, or I'm serious now. Oftentimes those gestures would look like flowers, or like gifts of shirts or ties or whatever, something to say, I get the message, I'm responding to you. And sometimes as the transgressions would get larger, the responses would have to get larger in the form of $10,000 checks. When I use the word extortion, it's like, well, this is the spiritual context in which he was getting money from his students by having us learn how to respond, which on one hand is really fantastic, but on the other hand can be used to try to create a response which, involves getting a lot of money.
I was a formal student on the East Coast for about 18 months. And in the full force of the fire, I regard that as the most destructive period of my life, from my point of view. Some people were in that for decades and were treated in ways that were much, much more intense than I was.
I said, how can I get people to care about this? How can I get people to care about this as much as me? I was thinking, well, what do people care about in our culture? People care about money. I said, okay, so prove it. So make a donation of X amount of money, whatever it was, to prove that they care. I wasn't trying to take their money from them. That wasn't the issue at all. It was to get them to express that they cared that much about what we were doing. And I somehow thought I could get away with this kind of behavior. And there was kind of a wildness and a radical fire in me that I didn't care. I said, I'll do anything to get people to care to get this to work. Over a period of years, I was just pushing harder and harder and harder and harder. And it was leading up to some of these more extreme challenges that they were facing.
He had the students in meditation for all day, 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day. That, in a sense, culminated with the big explosive event of July 30th, 2001.
Or they went into the state of collective enlightenment where they were kind of sharing one mind and one consciousness collectively amongst a group of, 30 to 60 people for months.
It's an explosion. It's like an explosion of consciousness where everybody enters into an enlightened state at the same time.
But it happened like spontaneously, or it
No.
was like the result of a...
I am the sole source. It's not funny, it's actually quite serious. It's only as a result of enormous, relentless pressure from me to force it to happen.
For a lot of us who were there we were able to be there at the end. We were lucky because we got to see the whole thing fall down and we got closure. And we were able to sit down with Andrew. We got to see Andrew fall. And Sort of, we saw the emperor wore no clothes. All these barriers were breaking down, and people started talking about, wow, oh my God, this thing might fall apart. They've done 25 years. These guys are masters, and yet they're being treated like children.
They all agreed they needed to confront Andrew, and that Andrew had to be stopped.
It's a glorious evolutionary narrative that still has his work as being historically significant. But he's not allowed to say that. He's not allowed to even think that anymore. He's not. That's the problem.
This, I'm out. I have been dealing with this bullshit for so many years.
Because you see, if I was fundamentally so ill-motivated, then I was fundamentally ill-motivated all along. And if that's who I was, then undoubtedly that's who I still would be. If I'm that full of shit, if I'm that insincere, a jive turkey, manipulating narcissist pig, if that's really what they think, then why were they with me for so long?